Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're diving into a topic a lot of you have been asking about, the Russo-Ukrainian War. And we're really going to go deep beyond the headlines to try and understand the history behind it all.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Everyone wants to talk about 2022 as a starting point, but to really wrap our heads around this, we got to rewind a bit further.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Let's go back to 1994, to a moment that almost feels, well, prophetic now looking back on it. Imagine Ukraine, freshly independent after the Soviet Union crumbles. They find themselves with this massive nuclear arsenal on their hands.
Oh, talk about a heavy inheritance. So what did they do with all that firepower?
They made a deal, one that at the time looked like a huge win for, global peace and all that. It was called the Budapest Memorandum. Basically, Ukraine agreed to give up their nukes in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the US, and the UK.
So a promise was made, a trade for peace of mind. But I have a feeling things didn't quite work out that way.
You could say that. Fast forward to 2014, Russia just goes ahead and annexes Crimea, that peninsula that's part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it was a blatant violation of that agreement they signed just, 2 decades earlier.
Talk about a broken promise. It makes you think, was this all part of the plan all along?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, especially with what happened next. See, between that agreement and Crimea, there were two major uprisings in Ukraine. The Orange Revolution back in 2004, and then the Euromaidan protests that started in 2013. And these weren't just local things, they really represented Ukraine wanting to move closer to the West, away from Russia's orbit.
So as Ukraine's trying to find its own way, that tension with Russia is just bubbling under the surface. It's like cracks starting to show in the pavement, hinting at the bigger problems beneath.
Exactly. And those cracks, they just kept getting wider because Russia used these movements, these pro-democracy movements, to push this whole narrative about protecting Russian speakers in Ukraine, which, if we're being honest, is a tactic we've seen time and time again throughout history, right?
Using people's fear as an excuse to step in and take control. So let's talk about that 2014 annexation. It really does feel like the moment things shifted. How did it escalate so fast?
Well, picture this, right? The Euromaidan Revolution, it ends up ousting the pro-Russian president Yanukovych and Ukraine. Ukraine's thrown into chaos. And Russia, they saw their opportunity. They sent in troops. And here's where it gets wild. They were masked, no insignias, almost like phantoms appearing out of nowhere.
Hold on, soldiers with no markings. That sounds like something out of a movie. What was Russia trying to pull?
Confusion, pure and simple. The media started calling them little green men, and they just swept in, occupied all the important stuff in Crimea, and boom, they had control before anyone even knew what hit them.
So testing the waters, seeing how the world would react. What did happen?
A lot of condemnation, obviously. Sanctions, yeah. But actual military action, no. It was a gamble, for sure, but it paid off. At least for Russia. They got Crimea, and the rest of the world, they kind of just let it happen.
Setting a pretty scary precedent. But Crimea, that was just the beginning, right? Things shifted over to the Donbas region of Ukraine after that.
Right. And the Donbas, that became a whole different story. It was like a slow burn, Russia backing these separatist groups who wanted to break away from Ukraine. And it wasn't just about territory. It was this war being fought in the shadows. Misinformation everywhere, propaganda.
And that's where we saw the truly devastating consequences of this shadowy war.
Yeah.
The downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in 2014.
Yeah. Just awful. 298 innocent people just gone. Really brought home the human cost of what was happening.
Absolutely. The world was in shock. For a while there, it felt like things could spiral out of control completely. Did anyone even try to, to talk things out, de-escalate?
There were attempts, for sure. The Minsk agreements back in 2014 and 2015, trying to find some kind of political solution, get the fighting to stop. But it was complicated. Each side always accusing the other of, breaking the agreements.
This kind of fragile peace, a stalemate that no one could break. It sounds like the Donbass was basically a powder keg just waiting to go on.
It was, this frozen conflict simmering away in the background, flaring up every now and then. But Russia, all that time, they never stopped pulling the strings, propping up the separatists, using the whole situation to their advantage.
Which brings us to 2022. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what had been simmering for years, just boiled over.
And the world just watched as Russian tanks rolled across the border. But as we've been talking about, this wasn't something that just happened overnight. It was years and years of, tensions building, strategic planning.
You mentioned earlier how important misinformation and propaganda have been for Russia. And we saw that in the lead up to this invasion too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember those Z markings?
Yeah.
Started showing up on Russian military vehicles everywhere. At first, no one had any idea what they meant.
Yeah, I remember people speculating like crazy online, trying to figure out if it was some kind of code. So what did they turn out to be?
Well, they were tactical markings, sure, but they became this symbol for the invasion itself, I mean. You saw them everywhere, on buildings, clothes. People in Russia were wearing them, like a badge of support for the war. It was scary how quickly this symbol, became so powerful.
And it wasn't just the markings. It felt like Russia's whole disinformation machine was working overtime to justify this invasion.
Exactly. They were pushing the denazification narrative really hard, which is just unbelievable when you think about it. I mean, trying to use World War II to justify invading a country led by a Jewish president.
It's a blatant distortion of the truth, and yet it worked. It's easy to forget about the human cost when you're bombarded with this kind of information warfare, but the reality on the ground was
Wow.
heartbreaking.
Absolutely. I mean, the numbers are just millions of people displaced from their homes, countless lives lost, entire cities
Right.
just gone. And then you see the brutality against civilians, like what happened in Bucha.
It's hard to even process sometimes. But beyond the immediate human cost, I mean, this war,
Yeah.
it's changed things for everyone, hasn't it?
Oh, for sure. The whole geopolitical landscape has shifted. NATO, for example, suddenly it's relevant again. You've got countries like Finland and Sweden who've stayed neutral for decades. They're rushing to join.
So a war that starts in one place ends up changing how the whole world thinks about security. We really are watching history unfold in front of
We
us.
are, and it goes even beyond that, right? Energy markets, global economy, all thrown into chaos because of this. It just goes to show you everything is connected. What happens in one corner of the world affects us all.
Makes you think about the future. Where do we even go from here? What's it going to take to bring peace back to Ukraine?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the truth is, there are no easy answers. It's still so complicated, so messy. Peace talks are going nowhere. The fighting just keeps going. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel right now.
It's heavy stuff. But even with all of that, is there room for hope?
There has to be. I mean, you look at the Ukrainian people and what they face, what they're still going through. Their resilience is incredible. They're determined to fight for their home, for their freedom. It's honestly inspiring.
It really is. And seeing the rest of the world come together to support them, to
Yeah.
provide aid, to stand up against this kind of aggression, that gives me hope too. But as we've seen today, there's so much more to this story than we realize.
Layers upon layers, right? History, politics, human lives,
Yes.
all tangled up together. And the more we understand that, the better equipped we are to make sense of it all. Not just for now, but for whatever comes next.
Well said. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. But before we go, we want to leave you with something to think about. So here's a question. How has this conversation changed your understanding of this conflict? What will you take away from this deep dive?
It's something to really sit with. We're bombarded with information these days. It's easy to just skim the surface. So taking the time to go deeper, to really challenge what we think we know, that's how we learn.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, after all. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Russo-Ukrainian War. And until next time, keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, and let's all keep striving for a more peaceful world.